All right, Jabosai, good morning, a good tavach. Hope everybody had a beautiful and uplifting and rejuvenating Shabbos as Chos Baruch Hashem to begin another week of learning together. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's shir, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tammuz, Daniel and Batsheva Pava of Hashmonaim, Eretz Yisrael, and for dedicating all the shir and drashos this month in commemoration of the Yahrzeit of their father, Reb Shlomo ben Yehuda Aryeh Vegh of Philadelphia, on the occasion of his first Yahrzeit. Reb Shlomo was a child survivor of Aushwitz, talmid muvhak of Reb Michel Ber Weismendel. He left 90 plus descendants who, Baruch Hashem, are yireh Shamaim. May his neshama have an aliya. Family, week of learning sponsors, the Brem family, Le'ilui Nishmas, their mother, Leah Riva Chaya Bas Mer Louise Brem, on the occasion of her 25th Yahrzeit. Louise Brem dedicated her life to uplifting and educating the most challenged students, as well as inculcating a tremendous love of Torah in Eretz Yisrael and her family. It's a tremendous schos for her family in Eretz Yisrael to sponsor the words of Torah, Baruch Hashem, over the course of this week. Steve Goloskov, in memory of Toba Rabinowitz, Toba Bas Yehoshua, Yaacov Zichron Livracha, sister of Shevy Friedman, and in memory of Adina Zahavi, Adina Batsheva Zichron Livracha Bas Dov Ber Azriel, the sister of Yossi Opendin. And our Daf Yomi sponsor for today, Alan Wiseman, in memory of Mildred Newman, Malka Bas Yitzchak Usher Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshama sav, bless you, the neshama sav and aliya, the families ein neshama. This should be a week in which all of our hostages are returned home b'shalom and b'karov. All of our soldiers are successful b'chol ma'aseh yadeim. And I will say, I think it goes without saying that when we opened the news last night on Motzei Shabbos and saw the assassination attempt on President Trump, independent of whatever your political affiliations are, when society descends to this level, when this is what is happening, with literally, again, how far away from here? 2 hours? 2 hours somewhere? I don't know exactly where in Pennsylvania, but a couple of hours away from here, it has to be a wake-up call. It has to be a wake-up call. We know we spoke about wake-up calls on Shabbos morning. We spoke a lot about things on Shabbos morning. But I will say, we may not be able to go ahead and necessarily, or I should say, we often think that we can't affect the tone of things in greater society, but we can. How we speak about leaders. You like President Biden, you like President Trump, whoever you like. Baruch Hashem, one of the greatest gifts we have in this country is the gift of the vote. So in Meretz Hashem, we'll decide who we want to be, or we'll cast our vote. But how we talk, how we espouse our political beliefs, how we talk about the candidate on the other side, the one we're not voting for, when you dehumanize people, and when you go ahead and you cast people in a certain sustained negative light, it has an impact. It has an impact where we have come to as a country and where we have come to as a people. And it's not just here, it's in Eretz Yisrael. We can't, it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable. Society descends into chaos and into violence when people dehumanize and people demonize one another. And it has to be, again, we are an Arlagayim, we are a light unto the nations. And if nothing else, just to be careful how we use our koach hadibor, just to be careful ultimately, again, how we go ahead and we use our power of speech and how we direct our political talk and how we talk about the other is so incredibly important. The Ribono Shalom should intervene in our greater society, in our greater world, because sometimes, like, you look around, and I don't know, I often wonder to myself, is it that we as a global community have descended into such chaos? Or maybe it's just because with internet and everything else, we know what's going on everywhere all the time. It feels like society as a whole is descending into the depths of chaos, whichever one it is. One thing is clear, which is we absolutely unequivocally need siyata d'shmaya. We need the Ribono Shel Olam to be able to intervene in a dramatic way, to kind of set the world straight, to set society straight, because it feels so often like we have lost our way. But when we look around and we see or we feel that society has lost our way, it creates an incumbent obligation upon each of us to model the right kind of behaviors, to model the right kind of behaviors in speech, to model the right kind of behaviors in dialogue with the other, to model the right kind of behaviors in disagreeing agreeably the Jew has to hold himself or herself to a higher standard. And perhaps if we do what's right in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, perhaps over time, greater society will follow suit as well. Should be a week of Besoros Tovos for Klal Yisrael, a week of Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael, for Eretz Yisrael, and a week of Besoros Tovos for this country as well. I will say, let's begin. So today's daf is Yotes. Today's daf is Yotes 19. We are picking up Emir Hashem on the second line on 19a at the two dots. So if you remember again, I will say we've been speaking a lot about the topic regarding the obligation to distance certain damaging forces from the wall of my neighbor. So for example, the Mishnah said over here a launderer's pool. So what did it say? So again, I could dig a launderer's pool in my chatzar as long as I distance it from the wall of my friend, 3 tfachim, v'sad v'sid, and you plaster it with you line it with plaster. We'll discuss that last part in just a moment. So the idea over here is if I want to dig a launderer's pool in my yard, I can do so, but I have to distance it 3 tfachim from my friend's wall. So Amar Nachman Lo shona ela mina mechamson, aval mina nadyon dalet amos. Now apparently in the world of laundering pools, there are 2 types of pools. There's what we call mechamson, which is a soaking pool. So Rashi points out over nivrecha sheshorn bo'as habegadim yom o yomayim b'tzuas klavim. So we'll say there was a soaking pool. Now it's interesting. Apparently, Talmudic detergent was dog excrement. It's hard to exactly understand how that works practically, right? But somehow, I guess it did. Yes, it did. And the good news is, relatively cheap and available. Yeah, this is not a Aryeh for dog ownership. Not at all. Not at all. You just find the guy who didn't get the memo and does own a dog, right? And go ahead and use him for help over here. So again, so you had the soaking pool. So in the soaking pool, you let the clothes sit in the detergent for a couple of days. Then there was something called the nadjan. The nadjan is the scrubbing pool. So kishmo kinu. That's the after removing the clothing that's been soaked. That's when you scrub the clothing clean. So interestingly enough, when do we say that you need to distance the laundering pool 3 tfachim? That's the soaking pool. But the scrubbing pool, dalet amos. You require 4 amos distance from the wall. Why the distinction? So we'll say it's very intuitive. Rashi says over here, because in the scrubbing pool, the water splashes everywhere. Shemar again will say, what is the issue with the laundering pool in proximity to the wall? The issue is that since the water splashes, we're concerned that ultimately it's going to erode the wall. So therefore, the Gemara makes this interesting distinction. When it comes to the soaking pool, you only need to distance in 3 tfachim. When it comes to the scrubbing pool, where there's a lot of splashing of water, that needs a distance of dalet amos. That supports this. A launderer's pool, dalet amos. You have to distance in dalet amos. The Gemara says, dalet amos, v'ha anan tanan gimel tfachim. But we learned only 3 tfachim. Why are you saying dalet amos? Allah shmaminu akid Rav Nachman. Supposed to say Masak Rav Nachman. Therefore, I'm going to say 2 different shiurim for the soaking pool, which is our Mishnah. You only have to distance it 3 tfachim. For the scrubbing pool, which is the pool of the Brisa, that requires dalet amos because again of the splashing. Others frame this as a question or a contradiction. Tzanan, we learned in our Mishnah. Nivreches hakovsin gimel tfachim. A launderer's pool only needs to be distanced from the wall of your friend 3 tfachim. 3 tfachim. But the Brisa says you have to distance the laundering pool dalet amos. Lo kasha, it's not a contradiction. Kan mina mechamson, kan mina nadjan. So we'll say same conversation, just framed in a different way. Our Mishnah is talking about the soaking pool. The soaking pool, because there's no splashing, therefore again 3 tfachim is enough of a distance. Versus the Brisa is talking about the scrubbing pool, where there's a lot of splashing. Because there's splashing, ultimately you have to distance in dalet amos. Good. Reb Michel Ber Weismendel explained this explicitly. Ultimately, again, unless you go out and you distance it from the chamsa. So we'll say, and again, in Rav Michel Ber Weismendel's version, he has the Mishnah explicitly saying mechamsan, not just saying a laundering pool, but identifying which laundering pool we're talking about, i.e. the soaking pool. So the soaking pool only requires 3 tefachim of distance. So we'll say, just, I was joking about it a little bit before, but this notion that, and Rashi points out that they would let clothing soak in dog excrement, presumably dog excrement and water, right, for a little bit of time, and then afterwards they would take and they would scrub it out, presumably scrubbing out the detergent, but also scrubbing out the stains. So I said there is something fascinating. Again, I don't know the chemical properties of dog excrement that allow it to work as detergents, but it is fascinating if you think about it, how something which, at first glance really represents that which is the most unclean thing, right? So you're using dog excrement to launder clothing. Right? So somehow the dog excrement is able to go out and remove the stains. So we'll say, if you think about it, there's an incredible metaphor in that as well. That sometimes, sometimes, thank you, Abby, thank you. Thank you for not just yelling it out also, by the way, I appreciate that. Okay, just whatever, you know who you are. Right? So sometimes it's interesting that cleanliness and purity comes from the most unclean sources. I was supposed to say, if you think about it, by the way, what are the greatest moments of growth in life? The greatest life moments, the greatest growth moments are when? It's interesting, at least I think, in the aftermath of sin. Everybody has that moment where I mess up really badly, right? I commit a significant avera. I'm like, you know what? This is it. Like, I am turning things around. It's interesting. As much as accomplishment fuels greater accomplishment, nothing fuels accomplishment like failure. In the aftermath of failure, the aftermath of sin, your dog excrement moment. Your dog excrement moment. Yeah, it doesn't roll off the tongue as well. It's all right? But your dog excrement moment where literally, again, your life just goes off the rails. Sometimes it's interesting that becomes your spiritual detergent. And that becomes your moment where you say to yourself, you know what, I got to live differently. I got to be different. I have to become a different person. I have to transcend. I have to figure out how to go ahead and pivot in such a dramatic way. So it's just interesting that just as the dog excrement could serve as the detergent to go ahead and remove the stains from my clothing, sometimes it is the moments of abysmal failure, our dog excrement moments of life, that serve as the greatest catalyst of growth. Interesting idea. Anyway, the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara is like this: V'sad b'sid. Now remember again, Rabbi said, interesting Mishnah. So the Mishnah said that if you have this launderer's pool, so now we've identified that the laundering pool in question is the soaking pool. So the soaking pool has to be distanced from the wall 3 tefachim, but then the Mishnah also says v'sad b'sid. So v'sad b'sid means, and ultimately you're going ahead and lining the pool with lime or with plaster. So the Gemara says, Ibailuhu, v'sad b'sid tanan, o dilma o sad b'sid. So we'll say, now the Gemara says, how do you read this? Do you read it as you have to distance the pool from the wall 3 tefachim and also line with plaster? Or maybe it's an either or. You have a choice. Either distance the pool 3 tefachim or line it with plaster. So that you hear the shaila, is it both or is it one or the other? So the Gemara says, Tanan, Pshit. So the Gemara says, Osad b'sit Tanan. So Pshita, Divisad b'sit Tanan. So we'll say, it's Pashat that is both. It's both. You have to move the pool 3 tefachim from the wall, and you also have to plaster it. Because if you would think that it's an either or, therefore I will say if that's the case, then you should go ahead and mention all of the cases of the Mishnah together. And I will say again, if halacha l'maisa, if it's either or, so remember again, the other cases of the Mishnah do have an either or, either distance or plastering. So if that's the case, this was also a case of either distance or plastering. List all of the cases together. To which the Gemara says, maybe not. No, the truth is you have to break out the cases, because remember again in the Mishnah, the different cases represent different forms of damage. Reisha hezeka demasuna, because for example, again, in the beginning cases of the Mishnah, we're talking about damage done through moisture. Seifa hezeka dehavla. But yet, again, the latter cases in the Mishnah are talking about situations of damage done by heat. So I'll say, therefore, we're still left with our original question. So back to our original question. When the Mishnah says, v'sad v'sid, does that mean that you must distance the laundering pool from the wall 3 tefachim and line it with plaster? Or you have a choice, distance or plaster. So we're back to our original question. So Tashma Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Sela hababi adayim. Of course, we had this in yesterday's daf. Sela hababi adayim means very fine earth, very loose earth, soft earth. Zeh chofer boro mikan, v'zeh chofer boro mikan. So let's say I'm neighbors with Ruvain, right? We both of us, we're neighbors in the field. We both have our own chatzeros, but in both of our chatzeros, it's very fine soil. So what's the halacha? Reuven could dig a bar in his field, and I could dig a bar in my field. The Gemara says, "Zeh marchik gimel tfachim v'sad b'sid, v'zeh marchik gimel tfachim v'sad b'sid." So I distance myself 3 tfachim from the border and dig a pit and line it with plaster. And Reuven distances himself 3 tfachim from the border and lines it with plaster. Now, listen, I watch this. Now, in this brisa, ultimately, again, it's explicit that what do you have to do? You have to distance and plaster. The Gemara says, 1 second. Talmid debabi adayim. Maybe the reason you have to distance and plaster over here in this case is why? Because this is a case of loose earth. So maybe it's only by loose earth that you have the obligation to do both. So the Gemara says, lo babi adayim lo. But in the case of regular earth, you have a choice, either distance or plaster, but you don't have to do both. To which the Gemara says, no. Not true. The truth is, even in a case where halacha l'maisa, the earth is not fine, right? Even in a case where halacha l'maisa, again, the earth is not soft, right? You still have to distance and plaster. The Gemara says, however, the Rice has to explicitly speak about the case of fine earth. Why? I would have thought like this. I might have thought that halacha l'maisa because the earth is fine. Therefore, again, maybe you need even greater distance. To which the Gemara says, Kamash Malon, no. Kamash on that even in the case of fine earth, halacha l'maisa, you only require 3 tefachim of distance and plastering of the wall. So we'll say, so bottom line, how do we paskin? So bottom line, the halacha l'maisa is that when it comes to this laundering pool, so first of all, we emerge with two concepts. Number one concept is there are 2 different types of laundering pools. There's a soaking pool and there is a scrubbing pool. Soaking pool requires 3 tefachim of distance from neighbor's wall. Laundering pool requires 4 amos of distance from neighbor's wall. But in both cases of distancing, halacha l'maisa, you have to distance and you also have to plaster the pool. We require both distancing and plastering. Incredible. All right, let's go back there. So the Gemara says, Marchikin es hagefes v'es hazevel v'es hamelach v'es hasloim. So remember again, so now we'll say the Mishnah went through in this third category over here. In this third category, we're talking about, so the Mishnah read, you have to distance melach. Melach is salt. Sid is lime. Sloim are stones from the coastal of my friend Nebos. And gefes is leftover olive pulp. Zevel is manure. Melach is salt. Sid is lime. Sloim are stones, but stones really used to produce fire. So all of these items have to be distanced from my friend's wall. 3 tefachim. So the Gemara says, so now what's the common denominator amongst these items? The common denominator over here is that they generate heat. So the heat poses poses a risk to the wall. So the Gemara says as follows. Good. So it's not Hassam. So let's listen to this. We learned over there. Now this is by Hilchos Shabbos, by Messiah Shabbos. So both say there is a concept of hatmana on Shabbos, of insulating a pot on Shabbos. Now the halacha is like this. If you look at Rashi, we'll say if I want to insulate the pot, to allow the pot to retain its heat, so esacham b'Shabbos, the amra abanam the asula hatnin v'davra mosif hevel. So we'll say, so the halacha is, and it's actually halacha l'maisa, that you're allowed to insulate a pot on Shabbos, but you can only insulate with something that maintains heat. You can't insulate with something that increases heat. The concern over here is that you may come to insulate with a coal and end up stoking the coal, which of course would be havara, which of course would be kindling. So listen to this. So if on Shabbos, What can you insulate with, and what can't you insulate with? So here we go. Ein tomnin lo begefes, v'lo bezeva, v'lo bemelach, v'lo besid, v'lo bechol, bein belach and bein beivation. So on Shabbos, you can't insulate with olive pulp, gefes, right? Zevel, manure, melach, salt, sid, plaster, or lime, and bechol. Bechol means sand, whether the sand is wet or dry. Now, listen, here's what's interesting. It's virtually the same list as our Mishnah. What's the one difference? Sand. Now, it's interesting. Our Mishnah has stones and not sand, and the Mishnah in Shabbos has sand and not stones. It says the Gemara, "Ma'ishnahacha diktani slaim v'lo katani chol, u'ma'ishnahasam diktani chol v'lo katani slaim." So why is it over here, Abosai, in Hilchos Shabbos, that it mentions sand and doesn't mention stones? And why is it over here in Bava Basra that it mentions stones and doesn't mention sand? To which the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yosef, it's very simple. If Yishem Darkon Shal Abnei Adam Lahatnim B'Slaim. Because it's very simple. The Mishnah in Shabbos doesn't mention stones. Do you know why? Because people don't really insulate with stones. It's not what was done. That's why it doesn't mention it. Amar Abaye, V'chi Darkon Shal Adam Lahatnim B'Gizeit Semer U'Lashon Shal Argamon. But do people go ahead and insulate their pots with long pieces of wool or with long pieces of purple wool? So we'll say that's not normally done either. Yet it's mentioned. Disanyo tomnin b'gizeit semer u'b'tzifeit semer u'b'lashono shal argaman u'b'mochen. So we'll say yet again the Brisa says that on Shabbos you're allowed to go ahead and insulate your pot with combed wool, right? With long, literally tongues, long pieces of purple wool and tufts of wool. They metaltanos, and however, they are muktzah. Now, the reason they're muktzah is because generally these items are set aside for the creation of clothing. Creation of clothing is Asra Shabbos. Shabbos says, so, but the point over here is, you see that when it comes to halachos of insulating, so even though it's not common to insulate with these items, they're still mentioned. So even if it's not common to insulate with stones, why not mention it? No. Yagid alav reo. Now we'll say, Yagid alav reo is literally, it's a pasuk. That literally means its friend will speak about it. And I will say, this is an expression that means as follows. This is an expression that means that sometimes the Gemara will quote a partial list. The complete list was referenced somewhere else. Once the Gemara now references part of the list, you understand that part of the list really means what? The entire list. So therefore, the Gemara wants to suggest over here that maybe once we have the complete list over here in Bava Basra, once the Gemara in Masechah Shabbos discusses part of the list, it means the entire list. The Gemara says, I'll tell you why that doesn't work. So Tana hacha slime v'hu adin l'chol, Tana hasam chol v'hu adin l'slime. So also what that means is like this. The Mishnah over here includes rocks. The Mishnah in Shabbos includes sand. So what it tells you is, since the rest of the list is the same, it means that just like in Shabbos it included sand, so too Bava Basra includes sand. And just like in Bava Basra it included stones, so too in Shabbos it includes stones. Here's the problem. Amali Rabbi, that doesn't make any sense. I yagid alav reo, listeninhu lekula b'chada, v'lisni chada me'inahu be'idach. So we'll say, here's how that would make sense. Let's say, for example, at Bava Basra, you would have the complete list, right? Everything we mentioned over here. So olives, manure, salt, lime, and stones, and sand. Right all over here. And then in Shabbos, it would just say olives. So, right, olive pulp. So then I would know that what? That's part of the list. So once you're referencing part of this list, that includes the entire list. The way this is set up, you can't say that really, again, in Bava Basra it's referencing part of the list, which really represents the whole list. In Shabbos representing, because neither location has the entire list. To which the Gemara says, no, here's the difference. Hasam hainu taima de lo katani slaim, mishum de mishtachi li likdeira. So I'll say, it's very simple. The reason why in Shabbos it doesn't mention stones is because no one insulates with stones. Why don't you insulate with stones? Because stones run the risk of breaking the pot. So because of that, it was just uncommon to insulate with stones. That's why it's not mentioned in the list. So I'll say, why isn't sand mentioned over here in Bava Basra? It's very simple. Mishum demechamimi chayim or mikariri karer. I will say sand. Remember, in this section of the Mishnah that lists these items, right? The olive pulp and the manure and the salt. What's the common denominator amongst all of these items? They generate heat. So sand does not generate heat. What does sand do? Sand maintains whatever the temperature is. So if something is hot, sand will maintain the heat. If ultimately, again, something is cold, sand will maintain the cold. That's what sand does. So because of that, it makes sense. So that now this makes sense. So therefore, again, stones will be mentioned over here in our Mishnah Basra, because halacha l'maisa, again, we're talking about the kind of stones that start fire and therefore could retain heat. They're not mentioned in Shabbos because people don't insulate with stones because they can break the pot. Sand is mentioned in Shabbos because sand is an insulating material. It's not mentioned in Bava Basra. Why not? Because it doesn't generate heat. Interesting. It's interesting, by the way, that this is the property of sand, right? That sand has the ability to maintain. I was thinking about this. It's interesting that the bracha that the Ribbon Shalom gives to Avram Avinu is that Kol Yezaracha Kichol Asher Svas Hayam. Klal Yisrael is compared to the sand. It's compared to the sand. So often we go and we think about that. It's a reference to the numerous nature of Klal Yisrael. So that's never the case, right? It's never about number. It's never about number because Klal Yisrael has never been the most numerous nation, nor do we find anything in our destiny that is supposed to be that we're going to outnumber anyone else, right? So we're always going to be a minority. That's the way it works. That's actually part of the power of Klal Yisrael. That's where a minority, not a majority. So what's the reference to sand? What's the reference to sand? So of course, on one hand, there's a beautiful achdus motif in sand, right? That each grain of sand by itself really doesn't mean all that much, but put it all together, right? And it becomes such a beautiful barrier in front of everything, such a beautiful barrier between heaven, between earth and water. So the power of Klal Yisrael is in achdus. But it's also interesting, I will say, that sand is a preservative, essentially, right? Whatever you put into sand will hold it. It's something hot, ultimately, again, so sand will retain the heat. Something cold, sand will retain the cold. I will say, do you know the greatest koach of Klal Yisrael? The ability to preserve. That no matter what happens, right, we never lose Torah. No matter what happens, whatever circumstances you put us in, we are able to preserve our Kedusha, we're able to preserve our Torah, we're able to preserve our connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the power of Chol. You put something hot into it, it will keep it hot. You put something cold into it, it'll keep it cold. The koach of sand is the ability to preserve whatever is put into it. HaKadosh Baruch Hu imbued within us a profound sense of Kedusha. And perhaps when HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Adam Avinu that your children are going to be like the sand, what he was telling them was, your children, no matter what happens to them in this world, will always be able to preserve that sense of personal and national Kedusha. Incredible. The Gemara goes, interesting enough, Rav Hoshia does include sand. He does include sand in our list in our Mishnah, to which the Gemara says, Hasam b'mesuna. So he's talking about damp sand. Damp sand, right? And therefore damp sand could go ahead and damage the wall, ultimately through the moisture. Tana didan nami lisnei v'lokim b'masuna. So what says the Gemara says, so why doesn't our Mishnah explicitly include sand and include it in the section that speaks about things that damage the wall through moisture? To which the Gemara says, Tana didan nami lisnei v'lokim b'masuna. Hatana le amasamayim. Our Tana already include things that damage through moisture, like the channel, like the irrigation, the channel of water. But 1 second, we'll say first white line on the bottom. But still the Mishnah has multiple examples of things that damage through a different way. So for example, it talks about the launderer's pool and the channel of water. Now both of those things go ahead and damage through moisture. But yet there's more than one example, to which the Gemara says, you need both of those. I'll tell you why. If it would have just said the channel of water that you have to distance it 3 tefachim from the wall, mishum dekviyah, because we'll say that is set in place. Once you dig that, that's going to remain. Aval nivrechas hakovsin the lo kaviyah, and a launderer's pool, we'll say, which again was common to move those around. Emalo, perhaps they do not have the same obligation of distancing them. Vitana nivrechas hakovsin, and if it would have just said the launderer's pool, mishum dekavah v'kaimi, because ultimately, again, because the launderer's pool, the water is stationary. So maybe stationary water is really what does damage. Ava amas ma'im lo, but the channel of water, the water is moving, maybe it doesn't do the same kind of moisture damage. Therefore, I need both cases. Okay, so what comes out over here? So now in this section of the Mishnah, we're talking about things that damage through heat. And therefore the Mishnah tells me, if you have something that generates heat, I have to distance that from my neighbor's wall 3 tfachim. 3 tfachim. So interestingly enough, even though the lists are virtually the same by Bava Basra and Shabbos, by Hatmana, by insulation, there is one interesting distinction, which is sand. So sand is mentioned by Shabbos because sand is an insulating material, but sand is not mentioned in Bava Basra because sand doesn't generate heat. The most that sand could do is wet sand could damage through moisture, but that goes in the moisture section of the Mishnah. And again, our Mishnah mentions stones, because we're talking about the kind of stones that are used to kindle a fire. Those obviously generate heat, and therefore, again, they have to be distanced. But in Hilchos Shabbos by Hatmana, there is no mention of fire, no mention of stones, because people don't insulate with stones. Why not? Because you run the risk of breaking the pot. Beautiful. Beautiful. All right, we'll say 4 lines up from the bottom. Yud Tes from the Aleph 19a. Says the Gemara, you have to distance seeds and the plow from your neighbor's wall. So I'm planting in my field. I have to distance my seeds and my plowing from my friend's wall 3 tfachim. The Gemara says, Zraim sevulei mishum macharisha. 1 second. I will say, how do you plant seeds? But Pashtos, if you're planting seeds, you need to plow the field. So isn't that one and the same? In other words, why do you have to mention them separately? Plowing and seeding should be the same thing. To which the Gemara says, no, but mapoles yad. We're talking about this. It's actually very interesting. Mapoles yad means there are certain seeds that you could plant just by simply going ahead and using like a hand shovel, right, to make a little furrow in the earth and just dropping the seeds in. You don't necessarily need a plow. So it really is 2 different cases. So even a case where you're not using a formal plow to go ahead and till the soil to plant the seeds, you still have to distance the seeds 3 tfachim. Now I will say, Pashas, why do you have to distance the seeds? Because of the roots. We'll get to that in just a moment. But that seems what we're concerned about. To which the was Macharisha. Excuse me, Macharisha. V'sevoch le'mishum zraim. So I don't understand what we'll say. So again, in the case of the Macharisha, the case of the plow, shouldn't it be the same issue of zraim? To which the Gemara says, B'choresh le'ilanos. Ultimately, again, we're talking about a case of where you're plowing for trees. Rashi says, B'choresh le'ilanos, sheyesh sham ilanos b'yomim rabim, u'bal la'acharosh tachtein la'ashbichon. We're talking about a case, we'll say, of where the trees are already there. The trees are already there. And therefore you're plowing around the area of the trees just to go ahead and improve their general growth. I will say, but shouldn't all of this be problematic? Because again, if you're going to have seeds and if you're going to be plowing, what are you going to be doing? You're going to be watering the soil. And again, I will say, that fits into the moisture section. So in the moisture section, again, we know that you already have to distance any source of moisture from the wall of your friend. 3 tfachim, to which the Gemara says very beautiful. Tana Eretz Yisrael kai. I will say it is always a good simon to begin the week with Eretz Yisrael. A good simon to start with Eretz Yisrael. So I'll say, so ultimately, again, the Mishnah is talking about a case of Eretz Yisrael. D'chsev limtara Shamaim tishtemaim. So I'll say, so in Eretz Yisrael, ultimately, again, Eretz Yisrael relies on rainfall. So ultimately, again, we're talking about that type of field that is dependent on rainfall and not necessarily watered yourself. So because of that, there's not a moisture issue. Rather, again, I will say what it turns out is there is a root issue. So really what it comes down to is like this. There's really 2 different things happening over here. The case of the Macharisha, the case of the plow, the concern is the loosening of the soil around the wall. So therefore, you got a distance plowing, right? You got a distance plowing from the wall 3 tfachim. The case of the seeding is we're concerned that even if there is no plowing, if you're planting seeds, the root systems grow out, and we're concerned again that the root system could undermine the wall. So the Gemara says, L'meimra. Now, we'll say, so based on this, what we're saying is as follows. So the Gemara says, L'meimra d'Israel amud beis. L'meimra d'Israel l'stadin kamishtarshi. Now, we'll say, here's what's interesting. So now that we've established this, so what I'm concerned about when I go ahead and I plant the seeds is I'm concerned that the roots are going to grow out. So what do you see from this? How do roots grow? Roots grow sideways, right? Because if they were growing down, there wouldn't seem to be a problem. So we're concerned that you need to distance the seeds from the wall 3 tfachim because the seeds are going to grow sideways and undermine the integrity of the wall. The Gemara says, but one second, is that true? But we learned, hamavrich hasagefen ba'aretz. So it's like a person, now, mavrich literally means graft. Now, what they really mean in this case over here is if you take a vine, and essentially you take the top of the vine, you replant it inside of, in other words, if you have one vine and you want to make it two, there's a great chat that you could do, which is you take the top of the vine, you plant it. Then what will happen is that vine will take root, and then you'll snip it in the middle, and ta-da, you have two vines. You have two vines. It's good to know. You have two vines. Okay, so now watch this. So the Gemara calls this grafting, right? But it's not grafting like we normally typically think about like taking two different species, but rather, again, it's taking the top of the vine, putting it into the earth, allowing it to take root. So a person goes in and takes a vine and literally plants it in the earth. So if there is not 3 tefachim of dirt on top of it, you can't plant something else on the earth on top of it. Ultimately, you're going to have a concern for kilayim. So the Gemara says, good. Rabbi will say, what can you do? This is actually very interesting. What can you do? You can go ahead and plant to the side of that vine. So we'll say, what does that show you? That the roots grow downward, not sideward. So therefore, again, that context we just said before. You're right. Roots grow down, roots don't grow to the sides. So if that's the case, I will say, so what am I concerned about? Here's what I'm concerned about. So I will say, even when roots grow down, what happens? I will say, there is soil displacement, right? There has to be. In other words, beforehand, there was just unbroken soil. Now the roots are going to grow down to their soil displacement. What happens to that soil displacement? So looser soil gets pushed up more towards the surface. That's the problem, because as looser soil gets pushed up, if I'm planting right next to the wall of my neighbor, then the looser soil ultimately is going to get pushed up and therefore erode the foundation of the wall. Therefore, the Mishnah says, plant your seeds 3 tefachim away. Not because I'm afraid that the roots are going to grow sideways, they're growing down. But like this, when there's soil displacement and the looser soil gets pushed up, that looser soil will be 3 tefachim away from my friend's wall, and therefore again will not in any way damage it. Incredible. So we'll say, so the last category in the Mishnah, the second last category in the Mishnah was meiraglayim, right? Well, really, the truth is, this is all the same category. There's seeds, plows, and meiraglayim, and urine. Now, the truth is, these are 3 different things here, right? So, in other words, we've established now, the case of the macharisha, the case of the plow, is because, again, I can't plow right next to my friend's wall because, again, it's going to loosen the soil, right? The case of the seeds is now I'm concerned about soil displacement, therefore distance at 3 tefachim. What's the case of urine? What was the problem of urine? So Rashi says the problem of urine is urine will dissolve the wall. Right? Rashi points out over in the Mishnah that the bricks were made of clay. So therefore, again, halach l'maisa, the urine is going to dissolve the wall. So therefore, again, if there's any urine, it has to be distanced 3 tefachim from my friend's wall. The Gemara says, okay, really, is that true? So the Gemara says, listen to this. Amar Rabba bar Chana. Mutar li adam lahashlim ma'im b'sad koslo shechavero. Rabbi bar Chana says, a person is allowed to urinate on their friend's wall. Now, also, never pashtos, like, not just stam. In other words, this is assuming, like, not just, it's a slow day, everything closes at 9 o'clock in Baltimore, so it's not just stam. In other words, a person doesn't have other facilities to use, or this is the closest facility to use. The idea is you're allowed to urinate on your friend's wall. So this is pretty explicit. In other words, you can't really read too much into this. This is what it is. So you're allowed to do this. So that seems to contradict the Mishnah, because the Mishnah says you have to distance urine 3 tefachim. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, that's interesting. Rabbi bar Chana actually quoted a pasuk. This fascinating, quoted a pasuk to support this. Vegh la'achav mashten b'kir va'atzar va'azab Yisrael. So Achav unfortunately was an incredibly evil king of Malchus Yisrael. The real tragedy of Achav, I will say, is not the fact that he was a Rasha. Unfortunately, there are Rishonim in this world. The tragedy of Achav is that there were a number of times where he was so close to doing Shuvah, but he didn't do it. The saddest thing in life is when I'm so close to self-actualization, accomplishment, and change, and just for whatever the reason, I don't seize the opportunity. So the pasuk says a punishment for Achav is Cheshbarach, who says, I will cut off from Achav every mashtin bikir. Now I will say the Gemara understands over here that what is mashtin bikir? Mashtin bikir literally means one who urinates on the wall. The Gemara understands this to mean men. Men. So the Navi is saying over here, I will cut off from Yaacov all future male descendants. But how does it reference male descendants? Those who urinate on the wall. So interestingly enough, so Rabbi Bachana is saying the fact that a man is described this way indicates to us that what? That urinating on your friend's wall is mutter. So the Gemara says, One second, what do you do with the Mishnah? Our Mishnah said that you have to distance urine from the wall 3 tefachim. The Gemara says, no, 2 different cases. Hasam b'shovchim. So I will say, so the Mishnah is talking about emptying out like a bedpan. Right, emptying out. So you have. Remember also they had obviously again, outdoor bathrooms. So I have an outhouse. I have an outhouse in my yard. Every once in a while, you have to empty out. You have to empty out whatever you call it, the receptacle. So that's when the Mishnah says you can't pour that out within 3 tefachim of your friend's wall. You could pour that out, but that has to be 3 tefachim away. Which makes sense. So that is a concentrated amount of urine. That's when you run the risk of pouring that out in close proximity to my friend's wall of eroding the wall. Masha'in came. A person just relieves themselves, stam, so that's permitted on your friend's wall because again, that singular stream of urine is not going to go ahead and erode the wall. Okay, very interesting. So tashma lo yishbach adam mayim b'tzad kol zol shechavera ela im kein yireh mimeno gimel tvachim hasnai b'shovchim. Fine, tashma. So as I said, now this interesting distinction. So now, when the Mishnah says that you have to be marchi, that you have to distance urine from your friend's wall 3 tefachim, now we understand it's talking about emptying out like the bedpan or emptying out the outhouse. That has to be done at a distance of 3 tefachim. But again, it is permitted to urinate directly on someone else's wall. Okay, so tashma. Lo yashin adamayim b'tzad kosel shechavera ela imkein hirchik mimeno gimel tvachim. So we'll say now this is interesting. Yeah, we'll say look at this brayso. A person should not go ahead and urinate on his friend's wall unless, of course, he goes in and distances himself 3 tefachim. So we'll say here we're talking about urination, not talking about pouring out the bedpan. So the Gemara says, when is that so? Because Salavenim. That's talking about again a brick wall. Because we'll say bricks are made of clay, and ultimately the clay could dissolve. But if it's a stone wall, so again, you just have to distance yourself. You just have to distance yourself so that it doesn't go ahead and harm the wall, damage the wall. But how much is that? Tefach v'shal sunma. So we'll say now this is very interesting. What happens if halacha l'maisa, the wall itself is situated on rocky ground? So therefore, again, the wall is not situated on soil, but rather the wall is situated on rocky ground. Then ultimately mutter. Then also you could urinate right there because since the wall is stones, nothing's going to happen to it, and since the ground is rocky, you're not eroding the wall by urinating there. So we'll say ultimately then it's mutter. So we'll say here's the problem. The problem is this directly contradicts Rabbi Archana. Because Rabbi Archana said you're allowed to urinate on someone else's wall. Here the Bryce explicitly says that depending on what the wall is made of, you can't urinate. It's not just pouring out the bedpan or emptying out the outhouse, but even urinating on someone's wall can be problematic. To which the Gemara says, you're right, tiyufta, the Rabbi Archana, tiyufta. This will say refutes Rabbi Archana that the halacha will say that the halacha of the Mishnah of needing to distance yourself 3 tefachim from your friend's wall is not just emptying out bedpans, but rather, again, depending on the type of wall, could even refer to actual urination itself. And therefore, I will say, halacha l'maisa, it turns out that especially if it's a brick wall, you cannot urinate on your friend's brick wall unless, of course, you distance yourself 3 tefachim. Incredible. So the Gemara says, but here's the problem. Rabbi Rechana brought up a pasuk, right? They both say again, he brought up the pasuk. And it says, I will cut off from Yaacov all male descendants. And how did it refer to male descendants? As those who urinate on the wall, which seems to indicate that urinating on the wall is mutter. To which the Gemara says, listen to this. Hasam hakikar is what it means to say, Afilu midi didarki leishtani bekir lo shaviknale. Baruch Hu says, I'm going to wipe out Yaachov's entire household. Even those things that urinate on the wall. What are those things that urinate on the wall? Umaynihu kalba, dogs. It's not a reference. It's interesting. We thought it was a reference to people. Right? Kamashla, no, it's a reference to even animals, to even dogs. The idea of Shmuel was saying is, I'm going to visit such desolation and destruction on Yaakov's home that even his dogs, right, even his pets, ultimately, again, are going to go ahead and be wiped out. Incredible. So we'll say, so that's, I want to point out, that's the end of that sugya. That's the end of that sugya. The Rabbi said the halacha from that sugya seems to be like what we thought originally in the Mishnah, that urine actually means like whether it's pouring out urine or even just urinating. If it's a wall of bricks, and the bricks are made of clay, and clay apparently, again, if urinated upon, you run the risk of some level of dissolution. So you have to go ahead and distance yourself more than three tefachim or more from your friend's wall before urinating. Incredible. All right, so I will say, so now we come to a new sugya, which is also going to take us into tomorrow's daf, which is a really fascinating sugya. So Shmuel says as follows. So we'll say, let me give you just a word of introduction. Right? It's actually, I will say, it was actually this week, past week's parasha. Tumas Ohel. So what's talacha, right? So incredible. Sunday, still parasha Chukas. So we'll say, so now what happens? A person dies in a home. So the halacha is that when that body is in a home, anything underneath, so a person dies in a structure, so that's called tumas ohel. That means the tumah spreads everywhere in the home. So we'll say, so now, what happens if, let's say, in that home, there's a mechitza, there's a wall. So that wall ultimately creates a barrier between the corpse and the other items in the house. That wall will prevent the tumah from spreading everywhere else. Okay, now, let's say now there's a hole in the wall. So we'll say, if there's a hole in the wall of a tefach or more, then the tumah spreads. Now, if you go and you plug up that hole, so suddenly again now the tumah is contained. What we're going to deal with over here is what type of item. So now we have a corpse in a home. There's a wall. The wall has an opening of a tefach. What type of items serve to plug up that hole? So we'll say, in other words, what could serve as a plug for the hole? What can't serve as a plug? That's our topic. So here we go. Says the Gemara. So I'll tell you about the same name of Shmuel. So now let's say again, so you have this wall. The wall has an opening of a tefach, which means that now the tumah is going through. Person puts a wafer. Rakik is literally a wafer. Person puts a wafer, inside. I was saying, you get those wafers for shalach manos, right? You're never quite sure what to do with them, right? So now here you go, right? Right? So again, so now I put the wafer in the hole. So now we'll say, now remember, I just want to point out, in order to plug up the hole, do you have to fill up the entire tefach opening? No. What do you just have to do? You just have to make the opening less than a tefach. Because once it's less than a tefach, it's as if it's fully plugged up. So now a person puts a wafer in that hole. What's talacha? Eino mema'it bechalon. It does not, so that wafer does not go ahead and diminish the one tefach opening. It's calling it a chalon, a window, but it doesn't have to be like a window, like a thing, it just means an opening. So a rakik, so putting a wafer there does not diminish the one tefach opening. Now we'll say, now look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, now what's the reason for that? So ultimately, the end of Rashi says, the chivun diray la'achila lo mevatel lahasam then have a kevechitza. Now we'll say, in order for something to go ahead and be considered to plug up the hole, it has to be something that once placed there is going to be left there. But because the rakik is edible, because the wafer is edible, but presumably a person is not going to leave it there. They're going to take it. They're going to eat it. So because it's not going to be left there, therefore it cannot go ahead and be considered to be a plug for the opening in the wall. So the Gemara says, "My yireh rakik." So I understand why you're bringing up just the wafer. Afilo avanami. Even if you place a cake there. In other words, even if you place something thicker, avan means something thicker, but it means a cake. So I will say the idea is the same. In other words, if you place a food item there, the concern is that can't plug up the hole. Why not? Something can only plug up the hole if it's going to be left there. But since it's not going to be left there, therefore Allah doesn't plug up the hole. So why bring a rakik, even an ava? So which the Gemara says, "Let me buy ava." Kivan de echsi leilam mevatek. So it goes to that as saying, if you put a cake there, that obviously is not going to plug up the hole. Why? Because since the cake is mamish edible, therefore obviously a person is not going to leave it there. They're going to remove it, and therefore because they're going to remove it, therefore Allah does not plug up the hole in the wall. About rokik, the man is ema betulim mevatale. But I will say about a rokik, the wafer gets disgusting, right? The wafer gets disgusting while sitting on the wall. So Rabbi said the whole chap is a cake could also get disgusting. What's the chap with the cake? You could always go ahead and cut off the bottom that was resting on the wall, right? You could eat the rest. The wafer, presumably just by sitting on the wall, gets a bit gross, and therefore Allah you're not going to eat it. So I would have thought rakik the mamis ima betulim mevatale. I would have thought that a person is mevatale. Therefore, the Gemara says, Kamash malon, that no, Kamash malon, that even a gross wafer, sometimes people will eat it. Get hungry enough, a person will eat it. Okay. The safer, so therefore, both say, if you have a hole in the wall, the hole is a tefach, I put the wafer there. So now, even though now the wafer diminishes the open space, because the wafer is something that a person presumably is going to take, therefore it's not bottled to the wall. Because it's not bottled to the wall, it does not serve to fill in the one tefach opening. I have a sefer the Havli Darshu Mekabel Tuma. The Chol Darshu Mekabel Tuma Eno Chotes Bifnei Tuma. So I say, 1 second. There's a bigger reason why the rakik can't serve as a plug for the opening. Why? Because the rakik itself is a food item. Food items are Mekabel Tuma. Something that is Mekabel Tuma itself cannot serve as a plug or a barrier against Tuma. To which the Gemara says, what's the case? Shenilosh b'mei peros. The case of us ultimately is where? Halacha l'maisa, it was kneaded with fruit juice. So we're going to in order for something to become, in order for a food item to be Mekabel Tuma, it has to have come in contact with one of the 7 liquids. So we assume that the rakik in question was kneaded with water, and therefore came in contact with water. Now, so the Gemara says, no, we're talking about a rakik that was kneaded with fruit juice. Fruit juice is not one of the 7 liquids that makes something receptive to Tuma. Therefore, that's the case. Therefore, I will say, therefore, halacha l'maisa, by itself, it would not contract Tuma, would not contract food Tuma, and therefore, again, I would have thought that it should serve as a plug for the opening in the wall. Kamash malan, because it's something that a person would take, it's not bottled to the wall, and therefore it doesn't serve as a plug. Okay, let's analyze the next case. We'll do one more case. Meisvei, Moray Zakasha, Kupa Malaya Teven, V'chavis Malaya Grogros, Hamunach and Mechalim. So we'll say, now watch this. Same case. There is a corpse in a room. There's a wall between the corpse and the room next to it. There's an opening of a tefach in that wall, which now allows the tumah to go through. I want to plug up the opening. So what do I put in there? Kupa Malaya Teven. There is a basket filled with straw, right? Or a barrel filled with dried figs. So we'll say, so now remember again, now the issue is the kupa, so the actual basket or the barrel, they're kalim. Kalim are mekabel tuma. So therefore the Gemara says, now watch this. So the Gemara says, Rowan, kol shili yinatlu v'yicholin tevenu grogros lamo b'fnei asim, and chotetzin ve'im lav in chotetzin. So it was a very interesting halacha. So we view, if the straw could remain stationary, even if the basket was removed, we allow the straw to essentially act as a plug in the wall, and we view the basket as if it's not there. Same thing with the figs. If the figs could remain in place without the barrel, so we view the barrel as if it's not there, and therefore the figs could go ahead and serve as a barrier to the tumah. Mara says, but 1 second, how could that be? 1 second, but Rabbi say, presumably a person wouldn't leave the straw there. Why not? Because the straw. Remember, Rabbi say, there's 2 things that have to happen over here. Number one, the item is not receptive to tumah. Number 2, it has to be the kind of item that you would leave there. Because if you would leave it there, then it becomes bottled to the wall. But straw, a person is not going to leave straw on the wall. After all, you use the straw for animal feed. Bisaria. We're talking about straw that's rotted a little bit. So because it's rotted, therefore you're not going to use it for animal feed. Chazilatina, but rotten straw is still good to be made into clay. The isbe kotzi, it has thorns. So apparently thorny, rotted straw you can't go ahead and use for clay. The Gemara says chazila asaka, but you could use it for burning, for kindling a fire. Bimasuna, it's moist. So it's rotted, moist, thorny straw. Right? So therefore, again, I will say it has absolutely 0 uses. So therefore, the pashtus, what we say is like this: as long as it could remain in place, even if its basket is removed, we view it as a plug for the wall. So the Gemara says, chazi lahesek gadol. But 1 second, but you can still use that type of straw for a very large fire. As Rabbi say, once a fire is very large and very strong, even moist straw could be used. To which the Gemara says, hesek gadol lo shchiach. It's not common to make such a big fire that would utilize this. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, this would be considered to be bottled to the wall. Grogros ha chazula. But what about the figs? Rabbi say again, b'pashtos, a person is not going to leave the figs there. Figs are fit for human consumption. Shmuel b'shes rifu. Ultimately, we're talking about wormy figs. So wormy figs are not really fit for consumption, and therefore, Allah a person is going to leave it there in the wall. Talking about wormy figs. Therefore, I will say again, we're going to stop over here for today. What comes out to us is as follows. So now we've created a model. The model is, first of all, again, a wall. A wall acts as a barrier against the spread of tumah. If there's an opening of the wall of a tefach or more that allows for the tumah to go through it, but if you plug up the wall with something, it allows the tumah, it creates a barrier. But that's only if the plug is something that a person is going to leave there. If it's the kind of item that a person would remove, then it does not act as a plug. So, for example, figs, if they're wormy, ultimately, again, could be as a plug. Or straw, if it's rotted, thorny, and moist, no use for that, could also serve as a barrier. Now, I will say, again, in the case of the figs and in the case of the straw, even though they are both utensils, if they have the ability to remain on their own, then we view the utensils as if they're not there, and therefore these items could serve as a plug. Now, Amir Hashem, tomorrow we're going to continue with this case and see more halachos over here in terms of the utensils themselves. What a way to start the week. All right, have a great day, everyone.